222. Hello and thank you for joining us this evening on the eve of the 2022 Seoul E-Prix. Thank you to Envision Racing and COP26 for hosting us as part of the Race Against Climate Change in conversation with event, the third event of the season. Now, the race against climate change, it needs all of us. Global transport accounts for 17% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's currently increasing. The recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has reiterated the risk of missing that 1.5 degree target, so we need to act now. But fortunately, there is hope. Sales of zero-emission vehicles is growing dramatically. Infrastructure from battery production and recycling to domestic charge points is starting to scale up in a big way. And the recent Gen 3 technology that was launched for the next Formula E vehicle as of next season is showing what e-mobility can look like in the very near future. So we're all in the race. So without further ado, I'm delighted now to welcome our expert panelists to the stage to help us understand how we can win that race. So we have Colin Crooks, is the British ambassador to the Republic of Korea, also serving previously in China, Indonesia, and the US. We have Dr Achala Abeysinghe, the Asia Director and Head of Programs at the Global Green Growth Institute, and an expert in international climate change and sustainable development. And finally, we have Sylvain Filippi, Managing Director and CTO at Envision Racing, who's been working at the heart of the global transition to e-mobility throughout his career. Now, Sylvain, I'm going to come to you first to tell us a little bit about Formula E and the race in Seoul this weekend. But before you do, we have a little video to give you a taste of what Formula E is all about. So there we go. Sylvain, what can you tell us about the event we have this weekend in Seoul?
Good evening. Thank you for joining us here tonight. That was a good teaser. So two things. Formula E, for those who are not so familiar with the sport yet, is basically an FIA World Championship, so the highest level of worldwide motorsport, dedicated to electric vehicles. So we are now in our 8th season. So we started racing in 2014. And the specificities compared to other championships that you might know, like Formula One and others, are that first, the cars are all electric, of course. And secondly, we race in centers of cities around the world. So logistically, it can create some challenges for ourselves. But the idea is to bring the sport closer to the people and then be able to showcase electric vehicle technology in cities so they can get exposed to as many people as possible. So that's Formula E in a nutshell. We'll talk a bit later, I think, about the roadmap and the technical aspects behind it. And here being in Seoul is very, very special. This is the season finale of our 8th season, but it is also the last race of our Generation 2 car, the car that we are racing now. So it's a big, it's an end of an era. It has been a fantastic car that has done so much to show the capabilities of electric vehicle technologies. So we are about to close the chapter and turn the page and start to unveil to the world the new car that will be racing next year, which is incredibly exciting.
Absolutely, we're all very, very excited to be here. Now, to kick things off, I'd like to ask you all a question, which is, starting with you, Colin, why is the transition to e-mobility important?
Well, thanks very much, and I'm also hugely looking forward to the races this weekend. Very excited, and the video's just given us a little taster of that, so that's great. I think there's many reasons why this transition is important, but let me touch on just three to start with. First of all is the climate crisis, and transitioning to zero emissions vehicles is an absolutely essential part of the response to that. I'm told that globally the road transport sector is responsible for about 1/5 of CO2 emissions. Transitioning to zero emissions vehicles is a great way of tackling that crucial 20%. If you can have zero emissions vehicles plus a decarbonised grid, of course, you actually make quite a significant dent in that set of emissions. The UK, as chair of COP26, brought together a global coalition of nearly 30 countries committed to working towards 100% sales of new cars and vans being zero emission by 2040. And so we're really keen to progress that, and this is a great example of one way of doing that. Second reason is health. Huge health benefit if we can transition to electric vehicles. You don't get the tailpipe emissions that you get with the internal combustion engine. Local air quality will improve, and I think if you live in a city like Seoul or other cities in this region, you'll really see the benefit of that. And the third reason is economic. The automotive sector is responsible for 3% of global economic output. And with many major economies now focused on that transition to zero-emission vehicles, it's going to be essential for countries to make that transition. And what we found is, with a lot of technologies that are green, making that transition can be a tremendous driver of economic growth. And I think that we're already seeing that in many of the countries that are making that transition to producing battery vehicles. And I think we will see that here in Korea as well.
Excellent stuff. Now moving down the panel, Dr. Achala, same question to you. Why is it important, the transition to e-mobility?
Well, I think we are all converts here because I have the same points as His Excellency the Ambassador. But maybe I could add, as a starting point, I was the legal and strategic advisor to the chair of the Least Developed Countries Group in the UNFCCC negotiations for 10 years. And I was very much in the core of negotiating the Paris Agreement. And I was also a lead author of the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So even though I'm not a scientist, I do know that to achieve the Paris Agreement goals and also to be in line with the recommendations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the transport sector has a massive contribution to make. And Ambassador mentioned that the transport sector is responsible for around 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a time that the emissions has to go down massively and considerably. But we all know that the emissions from the transport sector is still growing. And people and goods are on the move faster and faster than ever before. And that costs not just a price on a car or a train ticket or a ferry or a shipment bill, but it costs the environment. It costs the carbon budget that is left for the world. So there is a huge challenge now to achieve the goals set by the Paris Agreement, particularly if you have to think about the most vulnerable countries like least developed countries and small island developing nations. We need to reduce the emissions from the transport sector massively. And the good news is that the zero emission transport, the technology is there. We really have to make sure that the transformation is happening faster enough, and that countries understand that such transformation in their economies, in transformation in terms of the transport sector, will actually help not only reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but as the ambassador mentioned, to have greener, cleaner cities, have less pollution in terms of noise and air pollution, but also help our countries, particularly the developing countries, for faster industrial and economic growth. So I think all these facts together, it is important for the transition to e-mobility happens faster, and it happens through leadership like the UK government, through other countries that can make the transformation before the developing countries, and showing the way for developing countries also to follow suit. Thank you.
Some excellent points there, and hopefully we can dive into those a little bit more later on. And finally, same question to you, Sylvain.
Yeah, I will not repeat all these excellent points. The main one I can dive into is first big picture. Climate change is the biggest threat we face, no question. And actually, back to your technology point, Achala, which is absolutely correct. Even if you ask our own transport industry, you know, what are the challenges to switch to eco-mobility as soon as possible? There are many, but in a grand scheme of things, big picture, actually we have the technology now. We know how to do it. It's mostly a question of will and timetable and energy, really. So we know how to make very good electric cars now. The question is how to deploy them at scale. And that's the segue to Formula E. You know, like, I'm a personal believer that, you know, incentives are important in governments to start that transition, but our objective is to develop the technology fast enough so that anyone who wants to buy or drive a car actually wants to drive an electric car because it's better in every way possible. And it's already the case. We just have to accelerate that mass adoption. So this in combination with renewable energy, which is a key part of our team, really. And now we know that in the vast majority of cases, renewable energy is the cheapest power generation available for any government. Then we're at a point now where there's really no excuse, and really any new kind of power generation, transport solutions have to be electric and powered by renewable energy. So we are there, all the science is there, there's thousands of reports that show it. It's a question now of will and scale and implementation.
Well said. Now, moving things from a global point of view to a little bit more locally, question for you, Colin. To what extent does Korea stand to benefit by leading the global race to zero-emission transport?
Well, I think there are potentially massive benefits for the economy here in Korea. Globally, the automotive sector is responsible for about 3% of total GDP, but in Korea, it's actually 10%. So Korea is hugely dependent on producing cars for its economy. And we can see that the car market globally is evolving really rapidly. If you look at major markets in Germany, battery electric vehicles already account for about 15% of new sales so far this year. In the UK, it's about 11%. In the US, about 6%. But this growth is exponential. I think we're expecting in the UK that 11% will become 20% within the next 18 months or so. And we're seeing this trend replicated across many different markets. Korea is an export-driven economy. Korea is used to making things and living by selling them overseas, and automotive sales are a huge part of that for Korea. So what global consumers think, what global consumers buy, is absolutely critical to this country. And as we see in the UK, the EU, the US, fewer and fewer vehicles using the internal combustion engine being sold, Korea has to adapt. Korea has to respond to that. First mover advantage is going to be critical. Preserving market share is going to be a key priority for legacy manufacturers, and there are some legacy manufacturers, of course, here in Korea. They're going to have to fight it out with the new generation of EV companies. But so far, I think we're seeing the Korean companies responding pretty well to that. Hyundai Motors having huge success with EV sales in Europe and North America, precisely because they're embracing that transition. And indeed other EV battery manufacturers also here in Korea, like LG, Samsung, SK, other Korean companies in the supply chain also embracing that change, making that transition. This transition isn't straightforward. You do have to have a just transition for workforces who have spent the last 50 years making internal combustion engines, so skills, upskilling, investment in specific regions, ensuring jobs and growth continue will be really essential to Korea in making that switch. But the danger if you don't lead is you become not a leader but a follower. Korea tends to prefer to be a leader. Korea leads very well. Korea doesn't follow, Korea leads, and I think that Korea will continue to make that transition. But more than that, I think that Korea understands instinctively that net zero is a massive source of economic opportunity. And I think that Korea will grasp that opportunity. And indeed, by working together with the UK, I'm hoping that the UK and Korea together can lead this transition, because just as Korea has world leadership in things like battery manufacturing technology, UK businesses are very good at producing new lightweight materials, advanced design. Bringing the two countries together, I think, can be a really powerful combination to help us to lead and to move this transition still further.
Absolutely, and we see Korean manufacturers being some of the most efficient on the road, and you see that in Europe as well, a popular choice for EV drivers for sure. Moving down the panel, Achala, Korea is a trading economy, of course. How does the e-mobility transition look like in a wider Asia context? And what are the opportunities for Korea's exporters who could potentially be leading that green transition?
Yeah, thanks. I'll start with Asia. Electric vehicles, e-mobility is an important tool for all Asian countries to meet their various goals and targets that they have set. Under the Paris Agreement, of course, there are greenhouse gas emissions targets. There are also local air quality targets, mobility objectives, energy security, and also transportation resiliency. So overall, there are more opportunities beyond the greenhouse gas emissions targets in Asia. And in Asia, we know China is leading the e-mobility uptake, but there are a number of other countries that we are working very closely with are also becoming leaders in this space. And I want to mention several Southeast Asian countries, for example, Singapore and Indonesia. They have e-mobility targets and also internal combustion engine phase-out plans. In South Asia, we have India with strong commitments to scale up electric mobility at national level as well as state level. For example, the national government's faster adoption and manufacturing of electric vehicles, the FAME scheme, is leading the national level targets, and then there are 21 state governments in India with varying type of electric mobility targets. And then we have Pakistan with EV targets that was set in 2019 through the National Electric Vehicles Policy. And there are a number of other South Asian countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, and even Sri Lanka. Even though Sri Lanka doesn't have a national e-mobility policy, the uptake of e-mobility electric vehicles is quite high. Now, coming back, that's the reason for me to mention the landscape in terms of e-mobility and what's happening in terms of the policy space in Asia countries is to say that these are opportunities, these create enabling environments and opportunities for export industry in South Korea. When it comes to South Korea, we know that the Korean automobile industry is amongst the top 5 in the world, together with China, the US, Japan, and Germany, producing 3.5 million units in 2020 alone. And the automobile industry in Korea is a flagship industry, accounting for around 12% of Korea's manufacturing employment, 13% of production, and 12% of total exports as of 2020. And what I'm trying to say is these two needs to be matched. The ambition of Asian countries coming through policies and various targets, and the ambition of export industry in Korea needs to be, I think, rightly matched. It is, I think, important to mention that the Korean government has this 2030 strategy and the roadmap in terms of future car industry development strategy, which supports the distribution of electric vehicles and key technologies of EVs. And we, I think, Ambassador rightly mentioned the private sector, the companies like Hyundai and Kia, for example, leading the electric and hybrid vehicles development. In 2022, the first quarter alone, these two companies had combined export of eco-friendly cars of 100,000 units in the first quarter of 2022 alone. And these are thanks to sales of all electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles. So what's happening here is that the Korea is supporting other countries through their exports to meet the targets, various targets that have been set through national policies and strategies, as I mentioned. And Ambassador mentioned the battery technology and the related technologies coming through to provide further support are also supporting not only the economic growth of other Asian countries in the region, but also the recovery of COVID-19 pandemic. There is a huge dip in number of Asian developing countries when it comes to the COVID-19 and how the country's economy suffered. And I think through these kind of supports, through innovation, through exports, and through various policy support also, I think the Korea can be a leader there. I just want to mention that GGGI, the Global Green Growth Institute that I'm supporting, is our headquarters is here based in South Korea, and our president and the chair is Mr. Ban Ki-moon, who is the previous Secretary General of the United Nations, and of course he's from Korea. So not only, I'm just diverting from the exports discussion just to say that we are, of course, are also supporting our developing countries through financial support from the Korean government in the transport sector, which I would be very happy to talk about. Thank you.
Excellent stuff. Some fascinating statistics there. Gives me hope that we're on the right trajectory, but obviously there's still a lot more work to do. And one of the things that's helping that work, Formula E, of course, Sylvain. So Formula E has come an incredibly long way in the last 8 seasons, 8 years. Tell us more about the technology transfer and how what happens on the racetrack finds its way onto the road.
Sure. So you have to go back in history a little bit. So when we started Formula E 8 years ago, it was not so easy technology-wise to develop a racing championship and racing cars that go fast enough. So to do a race 8 years ago, we needed 2 cars per driver. So each driver to start the race, jump out of his first car, jump in the second car just to complete the race. And some people told us, what are you doing? If anything, you're highlighting the problem of electric cars. Like, what are you doing? And we said at the time, this is the starting point. We want to be judged on how quickly we are able to develop this technology. It's not about where we start, it's how quickly we can develop it. And so this was the Generation 1 car 8 years ago. 2.5 years of R&D later, we were able to create the Generation 2 car, which we are still racing today, that basically had double the amount of energy in the battery for the similar dimension and weight, 30% more power, and significantly more efficiency. So we're about to develop a car that has a lot more energy, has twice the range, and is also a lot faster and more powerful. In the normal internal combustion world, you cannot have all of that. You pick 2, you cannot have the 3 of them. So it's a really exciting stage of early development of pushing that technology. And the main idea is really back to the roots of motorsport 50, 60 years ago, when if you apply, maybe it's a bit arrogant to say the best engineers, but the very strong engineering resources of the motorsport industry into an automotive problem, you get a lot of very good results very quickly. And that's what happened in Formula E. So, as I mentioned earlier, this weekend is the last race of this car. And we are now testing the brand new car that will race next year. And again, it's a gigantic step of performance. So, to give you a few numbers, we started the Formula E at 150 kilowatt of power. We are now at 250 kilowatt with the powertrain and the motor at the rear of the car. Next year, the car will have 600 kilowatt of power, so more than double. That's almost, maybe kilowatt doesn't mean much to some people. It's almost 1,000 horsepower, and way more torque than you would know what to do with. So a very powerful car, but also the car next year will be smaller than the current car and much lighter than the current car, up around 60 kilograms lighter, which in motorsport terms is huge, a 60 kilogram reduction in weight. So to give you a perspective, the Gen 3 car next year will be smaller and lighter than the Formula 1 car, which is quite a feat because for many people, they think electric cars, the downside is that they are big and heavy. We are now able to make a car that is actually lighter and smaller than its petrol counterpart. So it just shows in 8 years the speed of innovation and what we were able to achieve with this car. And actually, funny enough, soon the problem we're going to have is that we need bigger tracks because these cars are going to be too fast quite quickly. So it's really interesting. And another statistic on the engineering side. Of course, what's amazing about electric cars and why they are the future versus hydrogen in most cases and so on is the sheer efficiency of the system. So our electric cars, our race cars, have a total system efficiency of let's say around 95%. So from the current in the battery all the way to the wheel, through the whole powertrain, we only lose around 5 or a little bit more percent of energy, which is incredible. The very best internal combustion road cars are around 30%. So when you put fossil fuel in your car, 70% of that energy and cost that you put in is lost in friction and heat. So when you know that, it hurts. In an electric car, 90 to 95% of it goes to the wheels, which is why the amount of energy used by an electric car per mile traveled is so low compared to a road car. So that's the idea. So yeah, the idea is to really push the technology really, really hard. Of course, we enjoy winning races and being part of a really exciting championship, but really the main pillar is that we are really accelerating that technology. And of course, the last point for which electric cars are renowned for is the regenerative braking, the fact that you recapture the energy when you slow down the car. And again, of course, the more you can increase this regenerative braking, the more energy you harvest. So to give you an idea, the Gen 3 car next year that will race, 40% of the energy used by the car during the race will have been generated by the car itself. So almost half of the energy used by that car is created by the car itself. That's pretty incredible. You can only do that with a very highly efficient electric car. And in the future, there's no reason why all the road cars will be like that. All the technologies we are developing are, of course, cutting edge, but all of them can be pretty easily transferred to road cars. That's also the real benefit. So yeah, watch this space. The cars you'll have on the market very soon will have capabilities that exceed the internal combustion cars by such a large amount that it will become a no-brainer to adopt electric mobility.
And that's not even mentioning the charging as well. Twice as fast as anything publicly available on the road, which is incredible. Tyres, we've seen range being increased over the last few years as well. It's incredible how much the developments actually do find their way into the cars that we drive, and I myself drive. It's incredibly exciting. Just to follow up on that, Sylvain, your team envision the mission to accelerate the race against climate change. Tell us more about that, but also in particular what the team owner Envision are doing also.
Yes, so as a follow-up, we are very lucky to be a founding team in the Formula E Championship, which is now one of the largest motorsport championships in the world. So we are lucky to be able to reach a very large audience, which is also not necessarily an audience that would follow like climate change conferences and so on. So we're able to reach and inform a lot of people in a really interesting way. So that's the second pillar of Formula E. The first one is the technical innovation. The second one is basically a very large media platform. So for us as a team, of course, the better we do on track, the larger our share of voice of that sport is. Hence the extra motivation to do well if we needed any. But the idea of our team really and the creation of our Race Against Climate Change program many years ago in partnership with COP26 is to use that media platform to talk about the future, but in a really positive and exciting way. That's my personal belief, and that's what we can do in the sport. We can show that a world where all the transport is electric and all the energy comes from renewable energy is something to be embraced. It's something that is really positive and really good. And as you guys touched on earlier, imagine living in cities when there is no noise pollution because the cars are silent and there's no pollution and no smell and no emissions and so on. It's just a dream. It will be a dream, be utopic to some extent. So that's what we are trying to achieve. So our team, we are not a car manufacturer. We're not here to promote the electric cars themselves. Well, we're here to try to explain how this bigger picture really makes sense and why we should embrace it and do what we can do in our daily lives to try to fight climate change, but also how governments and corporations and so on are doing the right things. And of course, it's easier. The Envision, the owner of our team, is of course one of the largest green tech companies in the world, and specialize in net zero technologies. So Envision is one of the largest cell manufacturer in the world, which of course is key to the adoption of the mass scaling of electric vehicles, but also renewable energy. So to give you an example, Envision is launching in Spain the first net zero industrial park, which is basically a turnkey solution for governments to produce renewable energy through wind and solar, develop and build gigafactories for batteries, which we know are badly needed. It's all about scale again, so develop these cells, and through the green energy, develop green hydrogen as well. And if you do all of this on the same site, you can then create a green supply chain that can then accelerate in a really big way the move to net zero in that local region. So the first one will be built in Spain in partnership with the Spanish government. And the goal of Envision is to build another 100 in the next 10 years all around the world. And for every site built, you can actually see a measurable difference in the race against climate change.
Incredibly impressive stuff. Now, moving on to the UK, question for you, Colin. The UK has quite ambitious ICE, internal combustion engine, phase-out targets. What might Korea benchmark from the UK approach to accelerate their own mobility transition?
Well, thank you. And actually listening to my fellow panelists, I'm increasingly excited and inspired about the path that we're all on. And you're right, in the UK, the targets that we have are aggressive. We've announced that no new diesel and petrol cars and vans will be sold from 2030. All new cars and vans must be zero emission at the tailpipe from 2035. I think that means also hybrids being phased out as well. But it's worth emphasising that our approach covers the whole of the transport sector. So it also includes increasing charging infrastructure, electrifying buses and railways, finding solutions to other sectors that are harder to decarbonise, such as maritime, aviation, heavy-duty transport. So we like to think that our approach to this policy is holistic. It is kind of all-encompassing. And the shift to e-mobility can be complemented, for example, by investment in things like urban spaces. If you can design your urban space so people can bike, can walk, that's also a way of making it easier to make this transition. Through our Climate Change Act, we were the first country to legislate emissions reduction. And we revised that act in 2019 to affirm that net zero by 2050 was the target. And since then, we've looked hard at every part of the economy and how it needs to respond in order to contribute to the delivery of net zero. One of the lessons that we learned is that industry and wider economic stakeholders can cope with far-reaching changes as long as there is policy certainty. For example, the decision that we made to set an ambitious ICE phase-out target for cars and vans was not taken lightly. The UK has nearly 1 million people employed directly or indirectly with the automotive sector. It's a very crucial part of our economy. But the reason why British companies like Jaguar Land Rover, like Bentley, which do employ thousands of workers in the UK, have felt able to make this transition to have their own ICE phase-out targets is because they feel confident that the national target is set by government and that they can align their targets with that because they have that policy certainty. And also because of the global trend as well, because of the commitments by some of the world's biggest companies to transition to their entire owned corporate fleets to zero emissions vehicles by 2030 via the EV100 campaign, which means millions of cars will be making that transition. This means that the biggest manufacturers can also have confidence that if they make EVs, they will sell them. There is a market, there will be a demand because of the way in which that market and those regulations are developing. And this certainly also aids investment in the infrastructure and technology required to enable this shift to e-mobility. So my advice to the Korean government is to act decisively. Korea became the 14th country to legislate 2050 net zero last year. And as government agencies, businesses, towns and cities shift decisively to implementation, further clarity for what net zero means for key emissions sectors such as power, transport and industry will continue to drive innovation, will continue to drive investment and will help the identification of solutions. So be bold and create that certainly would be my advice for Korea.
Some great advice. Now, just to follow up from that, Achala, Korea is rightly proud of its status as the first country to transition from recipient of aid to donor. What might you recommend within that realm of Korea? What could Korea be doing to accelerate the transition to e-mobility across Asia?
Yeah, so thank you. Before that, can I say, Ambassador, I was one of the beneficiaries of the UK government policies to go to e-mobility. I bought my first plug-in hybrid car in the UK. I got £5,000 subsidy from the government and £5,000 subsidy from the company itself. And also the rest was a repayable, no-interest loan. I think that's an example of how the government policies put into practice, so thank you. In terms of GGGI's work around the world, we have 44 member countries, including the UK and countries like Norway who are championing the e-mobility transformation. And in terms of our developing country work, we are supporting right now 15 countries in their transformation to e-mobility or sustainable transport, as we call it, including 7 countries in Asia. So Cambodia, India, Laos, PDR, Myanmar, Nepal, Philippines, and Sri Lanka. And actually today I got an email from one of the Korean ministries that another project that we submitted to the Korean government to be funded has been approved, and that's for Indonesia, for Bali, for an e-mobility program for $10 million US. So what we do is we work as a enabler and facilitator for our member countries in their transition to electrification of transportation, and we provide technical support in terms of mainstreaming sustainable transport strategies into national, subnational, as well as sectoral policies and development plans. And we link the sustainable transport solutions to existing transport infrastructure, as well as system investment. We convert the ideas into bankable projects and programs so that our countries get necessary financial support, including investments, and we also facilitate the participation of the private sector in the sustainable transport industry. If I may mention a few examples in terms of what our work entails through support from the Korean government, but as well as through support from a number of other donors. In Cambodia, we have been facilitating the adoption of e-scooters in Phnom Penh and also e-buses in Siem Reap, another city. In India, we are supporting the state of Andhra Pradesh in deploying 1 million electric vehicles and network of 100,000 charging stations by 2024. So right now we are working with the Andhra Pradesh government to do the feasibility study and identify the locations and develop the business model. And in Laos PDR, we have developed technical standards for electric vehicles, and we have conducted technical assistance for e-buses on bus rapid transit routes in Vientiane, which is the capital of Laos PDR. I also wanted to mention that I just came back from Laos PDR and we met with the British Embassy there. The British government, UK government has supported us to do an initial feasibility study in terms of two-wheelers in Vientiane, in the capital of Laos PDR. And now we are discussing a pilot project of around 100 two-wheelers and charging stations as a pilot project in Laos PDR. Few other countries mentioned. In Nepal, we have mobilized financial resources through private sector as well as the NAMA facility for 26 million investment mobilization in 2019. And in Philippines, we have demonstrated 100 electric tricycles in Palawan province and also have conducted technical assessment of e-buses deployment in the province of Bataan. So we are going beyond the national government to work with the provinces. And in Sri Lanka, we produced a technical assessment report for e-buses and also intelligent transport system in the Colombo metropolitan area. Beyond this visible work on sustainable transport, I also want to mention that for the transport sector to become truly zero emissions, it has to be linked to the renewable energy options, as you correctly mentioned. And we are working quite a lot in terms of energy transition, and that energy transition to be gender just transition as well, and also thinking about workers who may lose their jobs through the energy transition to find alternative livelihoods. And that transition, energy transition, is very closely linked to the transport sector work as well. So our work is growing. As I mentioned, we do receive quite a lot of support from the Korean government, but I want to mention that it's not just the Korean government. We do receive support from many other potential partners like the UK government and also the Green Climate Fund and various other potential donors. So thank you.
Some incredible ambitions there and thoughts about the future. So that leads me to a question for you, Sylvain. What do you consider the future of Formula E and e-mobility to look like?
Well, I guess faster, bigger, bolder. keep accelerating, really. So Formula E, we already have 400 million people watch the season every year, cumulative audience over the year. As I said, one of the largest motorsport already. So for us as a sport, the idea is to grow as fast as possible, because also just, every new people that watches Formula E gives us more impact, basically. The more people watch the sport, the more impact we will have. So that's the obvious first objective. And we do that through, developing cars that are more and more exciting and racing in more and more cities around the world is really the key to success. And for e-mobility, the two are linked, of course. As many EVs as possible on the road as every places as possible. That's the obvious goal. But it really comes through, again, the education and the messages behind it, right? For example, a lot of people tell us, start to try to think about the problems, like all the electric cars, it will trip the grid, in some places. And actually no, the grids will need electric cars because millions of electric cars on the road plugged in at night will act as a huge storage capacity for renewable energy. So electric cars will enable renewable energy, which will then enable the net zero transition. So there are a lot of amazing facts like this that, of course, if you people that don't work in the industry don't really know yet, but when we are able to communicate all these exciting facts about the future, then I think we get people excited and they will do the right thing. So that's the job of Formula E, really. Using the excitement of sport, basically. It's the mix of the passion that goes with sports mixed with technology is hopefully a powerful tool to lead the way and to show that the future can be exciting. And now it's time to get on with it.
Absolutely. I love the idea of a car not just being an A to B, it can be this resource, this system for batteries, for storage. It's amazing. One final question to you all, and then we'll go to the questions from the floor. So if you do have one, get preparing. Question being, I would like you all individually to identify an action for global leaders to take which would make the biggest difference to achieving the global ambitions for e-mobility, starting with yourself, Ambassador.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, the UK, for us, we're in the final months now of our presidency of COP26, and we're preparing now to hand over to Egypt at COP27, which takes place in just a couple of months' time. But one of the things that we've been focusing on during our presidency year has been galvanizing the world in the transition to zero-emission vehicles. As part of that, we've launched the Zero Emission Vehicles Transition Council, which is the only ministerial forum which brings together ambitious partners to deliver a cleaner transport sector. And there's still time for more countries, businesses, cities, other non-state actors to sign the COP26 declaration on accelerating the transition to 100% zero emissions cars and vans, and that's something we'd really like to recommend, because that declaration sets out a commitment to work towards all sales of new cars and vans being zero emission globally by 2040, slightly quicker for major markets, 2035 in leading markets. And signing this declaration, we believe, would be a critical signal to people everywhere that leaders are taking action on emissions, actions that we need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius in line with the recommendations of the Paris Agreement. So that would be my top ask.
Doctor?
Yeah, thank you. The Paris Agreement is the first ever universal multilateral treaty on climate change. And we brought in not only the developed countries like the Kyoto Protocol, but the developing countries to really be part of this transformation. But the silver bullet in terms of getting the developing countries to act is the support that they justifiably require. And those include for policy and regulatory frameworks. And in the countries for both combination of fiscal incentives as well as non-fiscal incentives, like preparation of e-mobility master plans, they do need some technical support. Introducing sustainable and workable business models for our countries, and these are necessary so that all the stakeholders can come on board in a systematic way to unlock the long-term value of sustainable transport and foster shared responsibilities in the developing countries, and bring in vehicle manufacturers, charging service providers and users, and all of these actors. And the third one is the actual financial support itself. It is in poorer countries, it's difficult for us to go in and say, stop everything you are doing, don't use coal or don't use combustion engines, just become sustainable and go electric in terms of your mobility. Their problems are way bigger than that sustainability itself, in terms of giving access to energy to their people, in terms of addressing poverty, in terms of addressing health crisis, etc. So financial support is extremely important if we are to help the developing countries to come out of the system that they are in and help them to get out of that system to become sustainable. And there are innovative financial models. Rather than expecting just the donor countries to come in and provide financial support, innovative financial models such as green bonds, for example, can work in this sector. And GGGI has been working on green bonds with number of countries, and we have prepared number of frameworks to support developing countries on green bonds, and now we are linking those to now transport sector as well. And the final one is the capacity strengthening. Developing countries, they are truly interested in developing their own capacities to manage their own transformation on the mobility systems in a sustainable manner. So this requires sharing knowledge, lessons, experience through capacity building, institutional relationships and partnerships, and also knowledge networks to drive learning, understanding, and also reduce knowledge gaps and ultimately facilitate action on sustainable transport development. And this requires also, when it comes to the government, working with ministries of transport, for example, or related departments, to really give them that capacity and the knowledge that's necessary to really drive the transformation necessary. Thank you.
Some great actions there, and critically, the support for developing countries is very, very crucial. Finally, Sylvain, what actions would you like to see global leaders take up?
Yeah, I think no question, legislation and regulation. Like, I think the private sector is really good at the R&D, the innovation, coming up with the solutions, but we need ambitious targets and roadmaps to focus the mind, really. If you want a slow transition, just let things go. But if we need, as we know, the Paris Agreement has kind of set out the framework and the goals. If we need a fast transition, it doesn't necessarily make all the stakeholders happy about it, but you need very clear and ambitious targets that are kind of non-really negotiable. And then you'll find the private sector will come up with the solutions to achieve it. The UK example is fantastic. 2030 is really tomorrow in terms of car development, and all the cars will be electric. We are lucky and honored to have signed a partnership with Jaguar for the next 4 years of the Gen 3 era I was talking about. And Jaguar as a brand will go all electric in 2025, which is fantastic, with a range of, I think, extremely exciting cars. So we need governments and organizations to set very ambitious targets if we want this transition to be as fast as we need it to be.
Well said. And now's a chance for any questions from the floor. Who would like to ask a question? One from the front.
Hello, thank you. That's been really interesting. I I guess as an individual sitting here listening, we've talked a lot about the role of governments and the role of policy that can be played. And what do you think as a panelist that there's that responsibility that we have as individuals, and where does that balance play between policy setting from governments? And we've seen some really ambitious targets set. Where does that line fall? Should we be pushed into making these decisions, or are we being kind of carrot versus stick, I suppose, is the question.
Great question. Who wants to start there? Ambassador, yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of the responsibility has to lie with the more powerful actors, and those actors include governments, but not just governments, also companies, sub-government level cities, towns. Those are the bodies that are really have the economic and the financial leverage to make a change. Individuals, we can all make little decisions, but it takes many millions of us to do that. I think it's the role then of governments to set the right incentives and the right targets to bring that out. Some of the policy we've been mentioning, and the other panelists have got some great ideas as well, can do that. But I don't think we can rely just on individuals to do the right thing. We have to get the regulation in place. We have to get the markets in place to do the right things. And we just heard about green bonds and financial markets as well. That, it seems to me, is the best way of mobilizing the finance, because we have to create a market, and I think we're well on the way to doing that, where people will invest money in zero electric vehicles because that's where the returns are going to be. And I think that's the kind of ideal scenario that we have to get. I think we're hopefully well on the way towards that.
Doctor, anything to add?
I think another good point to mention about the Paris Agreement is that's an agreement that brought in all actors, not just the governments. Initially, the whole UN negotiations was around, of course, still it's between governments. Those are the parties to the UNFCCC. But now we have a larger platform where around the Paris Agreement that brings in all actors. Non-state actors, the businesses are committing to also achieve net zero targets. So that has galvanized quite universally many actors beyond the governments. That's one thing I wanted to mention. The second is in terms of the carrot and the stick. I think at least when it comes to developing countries, the stick doesn't work to the extent that the carrot works. Our countries have to see this as an opportunity for green growth transformation, for economic development that is inclusive, that is resilient, and that is green. So we don't go to the countries and say, again, as I said, decarbonize, stop everything you are doing, and your development should not be progressing. We just say there are alternatives. And there is technology coming in, there are funding coming in, there are alternative ways of thinking coming in, new business models coming in. So you need to champion through your policy frameworks and through other institutional establishments, etc., to really grab this transformation, which is an opportunity. And I think I want to mention about the youth, the younger generation. I was in a panel day before yesterday, ASEAN Korea Youth Summit 2022, and one of the questions one of the young delegates asked me was, okay, we are doing all these things, so they had really nice videos of what every individual is doing from Philippines, from Indonesia, from Vietnam, etc. And they asked, what do you do? Do you feel like you are doing enough? I think they have now come to show that they have a very strong voice in terms of the future pathway of our countries, and that has come a long way to the extent that governments have started to listen to the youth now. So when it comes to individuals, I really want to encourage the younger generation to really think about this again as an opportunity for their future, not just wait for the government to do things. And my answer was that any profession that you go to, whether you are a fashion model or whether you are a journalist or whether you are a lawyer or a doctor, you can think sustainability in your job. And I think they do have a very strong voice now, and I think companies like Envision or Formula E, those are the things that I think talk to the younger generation way more than us going in and say, let's think about green growth, So I think this is a great opportunity for the youth also to come in. Thank you.
Sylvain?
Yeah, nothing much to add. It was really great. Just one, I think you made a really good point about the youth. We had a debate like this in New York a few races ago, where we hear sometimes, the young generation will solve the problem, and I take big offense in that. Like, we have many years ahead of us where we are in power, we have the means, it's our job to do it. 20 years is very significant, as we know, in terms of carbon budget. We've got to act now, and the young generation is expecting us to act very quickly. And in terms of individual versus collective, for sure, I think I've always been the view, it's my background of, it's our job to, in terms of eco-mobility, for example, we have to just develop the best products so people want to buy them and use them. I don't think we will never really accelerate a mass adoption of eco-mobility or any other sustainable aspects if we just expect people to do the right thing. Some people will do, but it's our job to make sure that whatever domain, whether it's electric cars or renewable energy that is cheaper than gas, whatever it is, it's got to be more compelling. And the good news is that we know it can be. So it's a question of scale again.
That seems like an excellent place, an excellent sentiment to end on. So thank you very much for attending, and please join me in thanking our panelists, Ambassador Colin Crooks, Dr Achala Abeysinghe and Sylvain Filippi. Thank you very much.